Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video I will show you how Fastapi uses Python type hints to do input validation. This is a simple Python function and it takes two arguments. The first one is integer, the second one is of type my custom type, and here you can see I have defined my custom type using the base model class that I have imported from Pydantic. So this is usually what we do in Fastapi endpoint. And then this function then goes on and print the type of argument A that it has received, and then it can print the type of the argument B it received, and finally it returns the two arguments. And the type that the function receives does not have to be the same as the type integer. So Python allows us to pass any argument whatsoever we want in our endpoint function. So for example, if I call my endpoint with a string and an array which are not the same as the type hint that we have defined in our function, then Python will run this without error. So you can see the function run, it printed the first argument, it printed the type of the first argument, it printed the type of the second argument, and these are not the same as the types that we have defined in our function. Python don't out of the box validates function argument based on the type hint, and if we want such a functionality, then we have to implement it ourselves. In this video I will show how Fastapi does it. The first step is to read the type hint information from the function definition. So the technical term for this line is the function signature. To read function signature, we will use Python inspect library. Let me remove this line. I will import the inspect library. Now this inspect library has a signature function and it receives a callable as a argument. So we will pass in our endpoint function, and this signature will return us a signature object. The signature object has a parameter attribute, which is basically a dictionary whose keys are the argument name and the values are the parameter object. We can loop over the argument name and parameter object. The type information is contained in parameter annotation attribute. I will print them and run the script. As you can see, we are able to read the argument name and the argument type of the function parameters. The next step is to use this knowledge to actually validate the argument. To validate a value using types, Fastapi uses TypeAdapter, which can be imported from Pydantic. We can create TypeAdapter object for any Python built-in or Pydantic base model type. This is a TypeAdapter for integer type. Similarly, we can create a TypeAdapter for my custom type. To validate a Python value using TypeAdapter, we can use validate_Python method of the TypeAdapter. Here I have called the validate Python method for the integer TypeAdapter, first with an integer, second with a string that can be passed into an integer, and the third time with a string that cannot be parsed into an integer. If I run the program, you can see the integer 1 and the string that can be passed into an integer are validated, but the third line, which is the some text string, which cannot be passed into a valid integer, therefore it raises this validation error that it is unable to pass a string into an integer. Similarly, you can verify that the validation will work for the my custom type as well. So here in the first time I have passed the my custom type object, the second time I have passed a dictionary which has two keys, attribute 1 which is 100, attribute 2 which is of type string. Let me show you my custom type as again. So as you can see, it accepts the attribute 1 of type integer, the attribute 2 of type string, and this is what we have passed in our dictionary. The third time we have not passed attribute 1, so I have only passed attribute 2 which is a text. If I go on and run this, then you will see the first and the second is validated perfectly, but the third one, in which attribute 1 is missing, it raises a validation error that this attribute 1 is field required, the validation error type is missing. We have now covered the basic ingredients used for validation with type hints. Now let's take a look at how Fastapi uses these two, that are signature function from inspect module and TypeAdapter from Pydantic, to do the validation using type hints. This is the Fastapi endpoint I used in one of my earlier video. Here you can see the decorator at the top. When we start the FastAPI server, this decorator line is executed and FastAPI read all the arguments of the endpoint function and stores the type information for future use. FastAPI code is highly structured, so you have to dig in several levels of depth to actually find the place where this is happening. I will search for the inspect.signature in the virtual environment. It is this get type signature function which is eventually called. It receives a call argument which is the endpoint function. It then uses inspect.signature to get the signature of the endpoint function. It then loop over the signature parameters and resolve any forward references or string based annotation. Finally, it returns the endpoint function signature. This get type signature function was called by the get dependent function. Our callable was passed to the get type signature function which returns the endpoint signature, and here if you see there is an iteration over all the parameters of the signature function, and the information about the param annotation, it is stored in param field. And if you see, this is of type model field. Basically this analyze param function, it returns a tuple of 3 elements. The first one could be anything, the second one is depends, and the third one is model field. So our param field type is model field. And if you come down here, you will see it will append this param field into body params if the parameter is of type body, and otherwise it calls this add params to field function, and depending on whether the parameter type is path, query or header, it appends that field, model field, into the headers param list or the query params list or the path params list. Also note that all these lists, the path params, query params, header param list, are part of this dependent object, and this dependent object is actually attached to the route. When FastAPI execute this line, it is actually populating all the information of the dependent into the app object. So we can access all the model fields data from the app object. Let me print this information. So I will go on and print the app dot router. So this is the global router, and there are a list of routes in the global router, and I will access the 6th element, and in this there is an object by the name of dependent, as we had seen, and in the dependent we can print the body params and also the path params. Now I will run the UVCon server. So let me open the terminal. I will go on into the backend, and in the FastAPI MongoDB template file, here I will run the UVCon, and as you can see, it has printed the 2 model fields, first one for the body params and the second one for the path params. And if I show you, the 6th element was the update route. So basically it has a path param item ID, and this is of type base model, so it has been added to the body params list. Let's see when the FastAPI actually validates the parameters. When FastAPI receives a request and it is solving dependencies, that is in the solve dependencies function, it calls this request params to args function with different list. For example, the first time it is calling this function with the dependent.path params list, next time it is calling it with dependent.query params, and so on. If you go inside this request params to args function, you will see the first argument, which is required params. It is a sequence of model fields. Here it loop over all the model fields, and then it calls this field.validate method. Let me go inside this validate method, and if you see, it is actually calling the TypeAdapter validate Python function. To summarize, when you define a FastAPI route with parameters, FastAPI reads the type annotation using Python inspect module, which allows it to extract all the necessary type information. It then passes the request data through Pydantic TypeAdapter behind the scenes, validating each field based on the declared type. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching.